Your Excellency Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, the President of Iceland, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, may the peace of God be upon you. His Excellency Dr. Jamal Sanad Al-Suwaidi, Director General of the ECSSR, would like to welcome you and is proud to have you attend this seminar entitled A Clean Energy Economy, A Road to Recovery from a Financial Crisis. This seminar comes amidst a series of seminars organized at the ECSSR and hosting VIP figures in the framework of the 20th anniversary on the ECSSR's establishment. Ladies and gentlemen, the interest of the countries of the world is increasing in the clean energy for its importance, economic and environmental importance, and it ascertains the quick growth in using the traditional energy sources to using the sources of clean energy, especially with the rise of the direct and indirect costs for using the traditional energy, and due to what the clean energy is offering and providing, including to lessen the environmental costs and to guarantee a safe and sustainable energy. And since the UAE is keen on benefiting from the development of the clean energy, it adopted a number of programs and projects to a certain constant and comprehensive sustainable development, which made of the UAE a main generator and an important player in the field of clean energy all over the world, where its contributions have been varied in the field of clean energy locally, regionally, and worldwide. And to ascertain this role, the UAE has hosted the headquarters of IRENA. The Republic of Iceland is considered one of the most important countries that has good relations with the UAE, and there are a number of cooperation fields between both our countries, especially in the clean energy, knowing that the Republic of Iceland has distinguished experiences in this field. It is an honor to welcome a known figure and who has a number of contributions in the field of clean energy. Allow me to welcome His Excellency Dr. Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, who will be talking in details about the economy of the clean energy to recover from financial crisis. His Excellency President Dr. Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson is the 5th President of Iceland, and it is the 5th presidential mission since his election, the first time in the year 1996. The President, Dr. Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, has a baccalaureate degree from Manchester University in England in the year 1965, and he has finished the doctorate in political sciences after the lapse of 5 years. He has become the first professor of political science in the University of Iceland. He has won also a seat in the Iceland Parliament in the year 1978. Then he has become finance minister in Iceland from 1988 to 1991. The President, His Excellency Dr. Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, during his presidential era, has ascertained the sustainable management of the natural resources in an effort to limit the phenomena of weather change, and he called for using the earth energy or thermal energy. He called it a renewable resource and applicable economically, and it's trustworthy. His Excellency, the President, has been a lecturer in different universities, including the universities of Peking and Fudan and in China, and the universities of Harvard and Columbia and Brown in the state of Ohio in the U.S. He has been given a number of awards, including Jawaharlal Nehru for International Understanding in the year 2007. It is an honor to welcome His Excellency Dr. Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson to relay his seminar about the clean energy economy, a road to recovery from a financial crisis. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
The floor is yours. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, first of all, thank you very much for this introduction. And let me begin by expressing that it is indeed not only a great pleasure, but also a profound honor to be invited to give this lecture on the 20th anniversary of ECSSR, and to be able in this way to pay my tribute to the excellent work of the Center, and to have with all of you a dialogue on the relationship between how to deal with a financial crisis and the benefits of creating a clean energy economy, with the emphasis on the word economy. I have been privileged to follow Abu Dhabi in recent years in its vision of promoting a successful and sustainable future through the annual World Future Energy Summits, and also the evolution of Master, both as a forum for science and research, but also as a significant global partner in the many clean energy projects. And through my duties as the chairman of the Zayed Future Energy Prize jury, I have also been privileged to witness how the leadership provided by the Emirates and Abu Dhabi has indeed been welcomed and endorsed by people all over the world. And it is in this spirit of friendship and cooperation that I come here today to address the linkage, which is not often discussed, between clean energy achievements and the success of overcoming a profound financial crisis. The lessons that Iceland can offer illustrate very clearly that these two areas, financial stability on one hand and clean energy transformation on the other, which, as I said, are often separated in both global dialogue and national debates, are in fact closely interlinked. The challenges of recent years, when, as many of you might remember, all the major Icelandic banks collapsed in the early stages of the global financial crisis in the fall of 2008, brought home to us in my country that the clean energy transformation, which had been executed in the previous decades, was in fact a fundamental pillar in what then became our successful financial and economic recovery. But before I talk more extensively about that message, let us go back to the autumn of 2008, when Iceland and other European and Western countries were hit by the financial tsunami, rooted perhaps in the fundamental fallacy that the financial markets should reign supreme, that economics somehow mattered more than good governance. And within a few months, the collapse of the banks in my country, one of the most peaceful and secure and harmonious countries you can find anywhere in the world, came to threaten the stability not only of our democratic system, but also the cohesion of our society. There were protests and riots which we had never seen before. The police had to defend the central bank, the parliament, and the Prime Minister's office. And the inherent balance of our well-established republic was suddenly in danger. In a country which had been, ever since the Republic was founded, ever since we started practicing modern politics, one of the most peaceful and harmonious democratic societies in the world, what I feared most in the early weeks of 2009 when I woke up in the mornings was not whether we would recover from the economic crisis, but whether the fundamental collapse of the financial system somehow had broken our democratic and social cohesion in such a way that it would be impossible to put it together again. We have the IMF to help countries to reconstruct its economies, but there is no IMF for failed democracies or failed societies. There we have no institutions or framework or how to repair it. And yet, the failure of the financial system had brought us close to a collapse, a possibility which in the previous decades had been almost ignored, not just by economic and political leaders, but also by the entire intellectual establishment of Europe and the Western world. We never assumed that a fundamental economic failure could create such a democratic and social crisis. And still within Europe, you can see evidence that many seek solutions of the profound problems that unfortunately some European countries still face through only economic and financial measures. Almost every day, the assertion is made that the supremacy of the financial markets should continue to subject other dimensions of our societies to their needs. But Iceland can, however, provide the significant lessons of how economic measures and reforms did not by themselves succeed in bringing the nation out of this deep financial crisis. The political, social, even judicial, and definitely also the energy dimension of our challenge was also of fundamental importance. And in the discussions taking place in Europe and elsewhere in the Western world, against the background of dire forecasts about the future of some of these countries, there are many who keep now asking, how on earth did Iceland, who was the first country hit so profoundly by the financial crisis, manage to advance so far on the road to recovery? So now, 5 years later, we have one of the highest growth rates in Europe. We have an unemployment which is only 4 or 5%, very low on the European standard. And we have a growth in almost every of our economic sectors. But in this transformation, the clean energy change that had been executed in previous decades definitely was and still is a major part of our economic recovery. And although that will be the main subject of my lecture here today, I also want very briefly to list for your economic interests a few other reasons. First, we did not follow the established financial orthodoxies of the Western world, which has predominated economic thinking in Europe and in the United States since the 1980s. The orthodoxy which was imposed on many Asian countries in their financial crisis 30 years ago, the so-called Washington Consensus. We, for example, let the private banks fail. We didn't try to save them with taxpayers' money. We introduced currency controls, which up to then had been a complete taboo by the IMF. We protected the welfare system, and to that extent rejected the orthodox austerity measures, which always had been advocated as a fundamental part of an economic recovery. We realized early that this was not just a normal financial crisis, but also a profound political and democratic challenge. And therefore, wide-ranging reforms in all these areas of our societies, not just in the economic sector, were indeed necessary in order to rebuild the confidence of the nation. And I say that again, the confidence of the people. Because too often in economic debates and policy making, it is somehow assumed that an economy is only a network of relationship between business companies, banks, and the corporate entities, forgetting that an economy is fundamentally a community of people. And if they are not confident, positive, forward-looking, energetic, it will be impossible to let the economy start producing in an effective way again. And in addition, as some of you might remember, we faced the so-called Icesave dispute based on the operations of one failed Icelandic bank in the United Kingdom and in the Netherlands. And the governments of these two countries, supported by all the EU governments and others, demanded that ordinary people of Iceland, fishermen, farmers, teachers, nurses, and others, should shoulder through their taxes the debts that had been created by this failed private bank. And under this pressure from all the governments of Europe, we had to choose between the financial interest as they were presented by this leadership and the democratic will of the Icelandic people. And through my decision to allow a referendum to take place, we allowed the will of the people to decide the issue. And in two referendums, the Icelandic nation overwhelmingly voted no. A decision which most so-called experts and financial authorities predicted would lead to utter failure. But on the contrary, what happened? The economy started to recover in the first quarter after the referendums, becoming healthier with every year. The financial doomsayers who advised strongly against the democratic will of the people turned out to be entirely wrong in their analysis and predictions. A result which should continue to serve as a challenge to many of the policies that are still being advocated in many different quarters. And when, in the beginning of last year, the EFTA court, which corresponds to the European Court with regard to Norway and Iceland and our participation in the European area, ruled that there was no legal basis whatsoever for the case presented by Britain, the Netherlands, and the European Union against Iceland. It became clear that all these European governments were not just economically wrong in their analysis and wanted to operate contrary to the democratic will of the people, but their policies were also illegal according to the European framework of financial legislation. I could, of course, continue to talk about this challenging, often dramatic experience of my country in the last 5 years, not only long into the evening, but long into the week. So rich is it in lessons and histories. But I wanted to summarize it here today in order to make you realize the immeasurable importance of the contribution made by the clean energy transformation to a process which was not just important to my nation in terms of the recovery after the financial crisis, but which was also of fundamental importance in the entire European context, even the entire global context of how we will in the future deal with financial crisis. Because one thing is certain, capitalism will still continue to have financial crisis. Whether it will be every decade or every second decade or every third decade, nobody knows. But while the system has many inherent qualities which are useful for our progress, it also has this side effect of reoccurring financial crisis anywhere in the world. But let me also, in the light of what has happened in other countries, including this part of the world, bring home to you the fact that throughout this experience in the last 5 years, we were also able to witness what I call a fundamental shift in the tectonic plates of politics and economics, in the role of the state on one hand and the market on the other. But also that information technology and social media are now empowering individuals to challenge established institutions in a way we have never seen before. And in this respect, Iceland also provides a profound illustration, as did the crowds in Cairo and Athens, and most recently in Turkey and now in Ukraine. When the protest gained momentum in the autumn of 2008, and the center of Reykjavik, as the picture showed before, became every Saturday the venue of street assembly, the internet served as the rallying instrument. And when in December of that year and in January of 2009, the rioters challenged the police, their mobile texting was the tool of action. And when in the winter of 2010 to 2011, the so-called barrel protest regularly reminded the authorities of their duties to the advantaged, the poor, the unemployed, Facebook provided the necessary group contacts. Demonstrations and protests, which in previous decades would have required weeks and months of preparations, involving networks of organizations, are now an instant phenomenon. The new IT instruments have replaced the more traditional tools of political mobilization. And what we experienced in Iceland, what characterized the Arab Spring, and was crucial to the Obama re-election, is, in my opinion, in all likelihood, just the beginning of a global paradigm shift, a new era in which individuals are able to challenge not only institutions, but even the state and the financial markets. Their advantage also derived from the fact that the old structures of decision-making, which we are all, the older generations, are accustomed to, are slow and take a long time in their deliberative processes. Whereas the new social media allows a multitude to assemble in a matter of few hours and demonstrate opposition to what the president is saying even before he finishes his speech. The experience in Iceland and recent events in other parts of the world have convinced me that the fast pace of change already created by the new social and IT media has gained such a momentum that actions within the more traditional institution of power could, in many instances, soon become almost a sideshow. And I know this is a strong statement, and perhaps a strange conclusion coming from someone who has spent a large part of his active life within those same institutions, the Parliament, the Cabinet, the ministries, and now the Presidency. Although all these insights and lessons are important for our financial and governmental future, the Icelandic experience also highlights, as I mentioned earlier on, how the clean energy transformation, which we executed in previous decades, has contributed to our economic recovery. In the introduction of a recent OECD publication on environment, the Secretary General of the OECD describes an important initiative called New Approaches to Economic Challenges, where he emphasizes the need, and I quote, for revisiting our economic models and theories and enriching our analytical frameworks, identifying a renewed strategic policy agenda for inclusive growth and well-being that also takes into account sustainability and the respect for the environment, end of quote. I believe Iceland is well placed to be a testing ground for this view expressed by the Director General of the OECD, almost as a laboratory where the relevant models and theories can be examined. Although I have spoken here today of the experiences following the banking collapse in the last 5 years, I also want to remind you, although it's hard to believe, that up to the 1970s, Iceland was still classified by the UNDP as a developing country, a nation still dominated by the traditional fishing and farming sectors, having for centuries been among the poorest in Europe, and our energy being primarily from imported oil and coal. I sometimes say to my African friends, what we have in common is I was also born in a developing country. And our entire energy resource in that part of Iceland came from fossil fuel. But in the decades that follow, we transformed our energy system, so now 100% of our electricity production and 100% of our house heating is provided by domestic renewable energy resources, primarily hydro and geothermal. And along the way, the economy has become more diversified, aided especially by this clean energy transformation. It has become the basis of strong aluminum and other high-tech industries, having aluminum companies like Alcoa, Rio Tinto, and Century Aluminum operating smelters in my country, and recently seeing not only dynamic IT companies, but also important data storage centers. Our clean energy economy has helped the people of Iceland not only to survive the banking collapse, but also to build a strong economy for the people, especially because the cost of heating and electricity for ordinary families, for homes and business companies is, in my country, extremely low, without subsidies, compared to what it is in almost every other European country. But also because it has made the country an attractive location for industrial investments, for the smelters I mentioned before, for the new data storage centers, and many other high-tech industries. It is worth remembering in this context that whereas Rio Tinto, which operates almost anywhere in the world, one of the biggest global companies on this planet, decided to terminate all global investments anywhere after the fall of Lehman Brothers, made its first investment decision when it started again in modernizing its aluminum smelter in Iceland, due to the availability of the clean energy resource. And Century Aluminum is now in the process of discussing building a second smelter in the country. Both of them inspired by the fact that clean energy gives aluminum produced in that way a strong long-term market position. And similarly, the establishment of new data storage centers, helped by the supply of clean energy, has brought many different companies that need to store their information in a safe way to Iceland. It's also worth noting, in order to show the business wisdom of this transformation, that our national savings resulting from the geothermal heating of the houses alone is such that every 20 years, the net national profit from this transformation, from moving away from imported oil to local renewable energy in order to heat the houses, the net national savings every 20 years amounts to 1 year's gross national product. So this has indeed been, in many ways, a revolutionary transformation in our own economy. But it has also given us globally a very strong position. The United Nations Geothermal Training Program, founded 3 decades ago in Iceland, has already strengthened the capabilities of more than 40 developing countries. And in recent years, Icelandic energy companies and engineering firms have participated in geothermal projects in China and India, in East Africa and Central America, in Western and Eastern Europe, also here in Abu Dhabi, and in Russia and in the United States. And it has increasingly become an important part of my presidency to use the clean energy expertise in my country to build relationships and joint projects with nations all over the world. And this is important not just for the business community of my country. It also illustrates our contribution to the battle with the threat of irreversible climate change. I come from a country, as all of you know, which not only has the name Iceland, but also has the largest glaciers in Europe. And we live close to the frozen Arctic. So we do not need to attend international conferences to be convinced of the accelerating rate of climate change. Our own neighborhood exhibits ample evidence that time is running out, and that without a comprehensive transformation of the energy systems, the entire world will already in this century face costly and dramatic consequences, not only of extreme weather events, but also of rising sea levels. And it is in this debate that Iceland can be of great service, allowing every visitor to witness in a matter of 2 or 3 days what are the effects of a clean energy transformation, but also to illustrate that as we go towards a clean energy future, we can also build the foundation for an extraordinary good business and a sound economic future. And let me therefore, towards the end, illustrate the fundamental core of this argument by giving you a series of examples of how the clean energy transformation has broadened the fundamental basis of our economy and thus contributed to the recovery after the financial crisis. And I often, in these discussions, put the emphasis on the clean energy economy, not on energy, but on the economy, because that, in its essence, is what the transformation is all about. First, cheap electricity and heating for households and companies has made the energy bill, both for families and enterprises, far lower than in any other country, increasing the resources available for other expenditures and investments. Secondly, long-term access to clean energy has proven itself to be a magnet for foreign investment, as I mentioned before. Third, the access to clean energy strengthens through low carbon footprint the global marketing position of the emerging dynamic high-tech and IT sectors, since the combined advantage of clean energy and information technology increasingly appeals to the enlightened customers all over the world. Fourth, greenhouse agriculture has indeed diversified not only our farming sector, but also our business community, enabled us to enjoy domestic production of tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and a variety of vegetables, which not only is healthy for us, but also fascinates the tourist. Indeed, we are now building a large greenhouse close to the famous Blue Lagoon, which will be the first huge enterprise of its kind, aiming at exporting tomatoes from Iceland to the European market, making Iceland a tomato exporting country in a very successful, business-friendly way. Fifth, fish farming, with geothermal heat, adjusting the sea and the fresh water, adjusting the temperature according to the needs of different species. The most recent example is a new fishing farm in the southwestern part of Iceland, aimed at growing every year 2,000 tons of Senegal sole. Senegal sole, as the name indicates, is a warm water fish. But by taking the spill of water from a nearby geothermal power plant and use it to heat the cold North Atlantic water, we can fool the Senegal sole and let it think that it is swimming in the warm waters closer to the Emirates. This can then be repeated on an even bigger scale. The sixth element is the importance of the clean energy transformation to tourism. Most of you might have heard the Blue Lagoon, which now has become a famous tourist landmark. Even the National Geographic, the famous publication, chose last year 25 most remarkable places on planet Earth. 24 of those were created by God Almighty. But the 25th, the Blue Lagoon, was created from the spill of water from a geothermal power plant in Iceland, where we now charge every tourist 40 euros for the privilege of bathing themselves in the spill of water from a power plant. A fascinating example of how a clean energy transformation can broaden your tourism. So now, within 3 years, the estimation is that annually 1 million tourists will visit this phenomenon of spill of water from a power plant, which gives you a healthier body and a longer life than you would have before. And this also relates to the seventh element, which is health and cosmetics. Because the chemicals in the geothermal water and the growing of barley in greenhouses has turned out to be a fertile basis for a high-tech cosmetic and health products. So now you can fly on Air France and buy a very important liquid in small bottles, which makes your skin younger, makes you look more beautiful, and fresh every day. So the clean energy transformation in this greenhouse has enabled us to compete with La Combe on board Air France. A shift in thinking about clean energy that probably most of you find quite surprising. Of more importance is the eighth element, the drying of fish products, especially fish heads, backbones, and other parts, which previously we threw away back into the ocean. But in the last 30 years, we have dried those products and sold them to the Nigerian markets, where they are sold by the street vendors. Because once you have dried a food product of this kind, you can store it for up to 2 years without any infrastructure. And this can be done for meat, for fruit, for vegetables, using solar, wind, in addition to geothermal. And we are now discussing with IRENA, as well as MASTER and others, the FAO and many other willing international partners, how to take this experience of drying fish products in Iceland, implementing it in other food production areas, and thereby enhance food security globally in a way that most people have thought unthinkable before. The ninth element is the economic of zero-emission urban traffic by introducing electric cars, hydrogen vehicles, and others using the national renewable sources that we have in our country. In addition to all of this, we have the 10th element, which is the importance of the clean energy transformation to our universities, to our engineering firms, to our energy companies, helping us to build a very strong high-tech sector of engineering and science, which is now the basis of export-driven to the companies. And in addition, as I mentioned before, this has enabled us to build diplomatic bridges, political cooperation, and economic enterprises with countries in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas. We are now, with the help of the new president of China, in the process of building geothermal urban heating systems in one Chinese city after another, closing the coal power stations that pollute the Chinese cities and enable the people not only to enjoy a different form of energy, but also a healthier life, reducing lung cancer, and enabling the kids and the future generation in the Chinese cities to enjoy a healthier life. All of this is based on the clean energy transformation, which started in my country 40 to 50 years ago. It is, in addition to our economic recovery, an extensive evidence of how a clean energy transformation is not only a safeguard against the challenges of financial crisis in the futures to come, but it also builds a broad, effective, and profitable basis for a successful 21st century economy. And with these words, I conclude my lecture and would be happy to answer any questions or respond to any comment you would like to offer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President, for this interesting lectures and thoughts. You give us clear picture about how the clean energy economies affected the financial side and the economic side, and how affected all areas of the countries. You give us experience of Iceland, how deal with the financial crisis, and how they built their big economy, and how they involve and contribute in the global economy. Now we will open the floor for the questions, and I want to ask everybody to introduce themselves and then ask a question, make it short as possible. As Dr. Abdurrahman Asiri, our guest from Kuwait, we will start with you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. President, I enjoy listening to your speech and enjoy more seeing the pictures. I felt nostalgic to your country to visit again. You live in a very tranquil, peaceful, environment, clean society. Mr. President, as you've said, your country has been through so many turmoils. Perhaps you've emphasized the economic part in the last few years, but you've been through a lot of political issues and crises here and there with your neighbors far away and distant. You live in the middle of nowhere in the Atlantic, but you still were viewed Iceland as the most peaceful, tranquil country in the world for a number of reasons. One of them, you don't have armed forces. You have low rate of crime, very good socio-economic indicators. What advices, as a president for so many years and visit so many countries in the first world, in the second world, and the third world countries, what advices would you give to those people who live around here to become a new Iceland? We will not compete with you, we'll become a second level Iceland. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much for this question. It is indeed a challenging question. But let me bring you back to the formative years of my political life. Even the first decades when I was a member of parliament and served as a minister in the government. Because for more than 50 years, my part of the world, the most northern part, sometimes called the Arctic part of the world, saw the most extensive military buildup anywhere in the world during the Cold War. The tension between the Soviet Union and the Warsaw countries on one hand, and NATO and the United States on the other, was nowhere more dramatic than in my part of the world. That is why the United States had a military base in Iceland for more than 50 years. That is why there were military bases from Alaska through Canada, through Greenland and Iceland to northern Norway and deep into the northern part of Russia. There were submarines, there were military planes, there were missiles. There was every form of military technology invented and created. And the enormous amount of money spent on this military buildup in the second half of the 20th century is mind-boggling. But now, 15, 20 years after the Cold War ended, the northern regions, the Arctic regions, have become one of the most cooperative, peaceful, and stable parts of the world, where Russia and the United States work hand in hand. Might be surprising, listening in recent days to what they say to each other about Ukraine, but where they work constructively hand in hand, together with Canada and the 5 Nordic countries. And now, after the ministerial meeting last year in May, more than half of the G20 countries have decided to have a seat at the Arctic table in one way or another after being accepted as observer states in the Arctic Council. Singapore, South Korea, China, Japan, France, Germany, United Kingdom, maybe the United Arab Emirates one day. And I tell you this because for my generation, where every part of our political training and our political thinking was dominated by this military tension and conflict of the Cold War, to see this transformation in just over a decade is a monumental proof that regions can be transformed from military conflict and hostile stand backed up by every form of military technology into an area and region of cooperation and peace. That is why I say paradoxically, the Middle East should start looking at the Arctic. I hosted last year, will do again in September, together with some other leaders in the Arctic regions, a kind of an Arctic Davos called the Arctic Circle that takes place in my country next September, where over 1,000 representatives from over 40 countries came together to discuss this transformation and the future. And I think, and I say this very sincerely to my friends in the Emirates and Abu Dhabi, that by looking at the Arctic model, you can see and hopefully find inspiration that your part of the world does not necessarily have to be so. Already the countries in the Himalaya region, from India, China, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, are looking at the Arctic model. There are nuclear powers, Pakistan, India, China. The Himalayas are also one of the most militarized, conflict-ridden areas in the world, and with the disappearance of the glaciers in the Himalayas, the conflict over water in China, India, and elsewhere in Asia can be dramatic. So the lesson I have taken from all of this is that change is possible, that the vision of peace and cooperation is practical politics. It's not naive. It's not naive. And the other lesson I've taken from my long involvement on a different level, more in terms of internal politics of my country, might sound strange to many who have gotten used to this 24-hour circle of spin and PR that dominates our political thinking and strategies every day, where people somehow, or leaders somehow, assume that with clever PR strategies they can spin the population into any form they want. Whereas my fundamental lesson is trust the people, trust the ordinary people, because their inner wisdom and their sense of fairness is a better guide to a strong, peaceful, sustainable future than clever strategies. Maybe I shouldn't say this in a center devoted to research and extensive knowledge. But you asked me about the lessons, and these are the two lessons I've taken. One is that peace is possible. Conflict can be replaced by cooperation, even in the most militarized part of the world. And within our societies, we should be guided by the wisdom of the ordinary people.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, please.
Jamil Mohammed, EC.
Mohammed, ECA.
It appears that the European countries treated Iceland with kids' gloves during the financial crisis. My question would be, if a third world country was in the same situation as Iceland, how would the European countries have treated the third world country? The second point or comment I want to make is, you stated a lot about the relationship between the people and the direction in which the country should be moving. As an example, you gave Iceland, and they decided the direction and the solution to the financial problem there. Unfortunately, countries such as Chile, when they decided to go in a particular direction, the government was overthrown. When Iran in 1954 did the same thing, American-backed overthrow of the Iranian government at that particular time. Nicaragua, the same thing in the 1980s, when they decided to go to a particular country, direction, a lot of pressure was put on them. Algeria, the same thing. Yes, I agree with you, there should be a paradigm shift, and I agree with you that it should be organic and should be rooted in the culture, the belief of the people. Thank you very much.
Well, with all due respect, I don't think the European countries treated us with kid gloves. Because Germany, France, and the other leading European Union countries somehow decided to support Britain and the Netherlands in the board of the IMF by completely blocking the IMF program for Iceland unless we agreed to the unilateral demands for a negotiated settlement of these debt by private banks taken over by the Icelandic people. It was the first time in the history of the IMF that such what we call in the Security Council a veto power was exercised against an economic reconstruction program for a country unless it agreed to the pressure provided by two members of the IMF. And I know the professional leadership of the IMF was absolutely outraged that the institution was used in this way. And it was not kid gloves when the Gordon Brown government decided to put Iceland on the list of terrorist organizations, together with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, as an official classification by the British government, which you could read on the website, thereby closing every financial connection with Iceland, international. And it was only because Mervyn King, the governor of the Bank of England, refused to go along that we were able to continue. I mean, I'm not going to talk about Al-Qaeda and the Taliban here today, but I don't think it's rocket science to think that to put Iceland together with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, I mean, it's crazy, if anything is crazy. A founding member of NATO, a country without army, which has gone with peace towards every country in the world, is that kid gloves? No, of course not. So unfortunately, I have to say that the treatment we got was as far from kid gloves as you could do in an interchange between any Western European country in recent decades. And you can't find any other example of this. And although I can't speculate about what they would have done to a third world country, I don't think they would have behaved in this kind of way. So, as you can hear, I mean, I'm still angry about this. We have a long history in Iceland. We still talk about the Vikings who settled in our country 1,000 years ago. You can still visit parts of Iceland where people tell you stories of those who settled there 1,000 years ago. So we will never forget this. And as I said on Sky Television last year, Gordon Brown will be long remembered in my country after he is completely forgotten in Britain and the rest of the world. Because for us, a country so peaceful, without any armed forces, without any tradition of violence and threats to be put officially on the terrorist list, together with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, was not only a financial nuclear bomb towards my country, but was such a cultural offense to the people of Iceland and our identity and our democratic tradition that we will never forget it. Of course, you're right. In the last 30, 40, 50 years, you can find many examples of important countries using their power to try to overthrow governments and so on. But as I argued in my lecture, based on my experience, I think the transformation towards social media and information technology, which means that every citizen with a mobile phone can now be a global reporter, can send pictures and images of what's happening instantaneously around the world. And where the gathering of individuals like the people in the square in Cairo, which when Obama was trying to change the US policy first time, indicated through their mobile messages that that was not enough before he had finished his speech. The first time in history that a crowd in a faraway country assembled in a square turned the president of the United States down before he finished his speech. And this powerful instrument, which was only created less than 5 years ago or so as an important tool, to me means that any leader, however strong the country is militarily or financially, now has to face a situation where the democratic empowerment of anybody in any street, anywhere, can challenge the policies in a way that has never been possible before. And it puts us in so-called position of leadership in a completely new situation. Completely new situation. And I think most of us, if not all of us, have not yet fully comprehended the implication of this. You can watch the Ukrainian story in the coming days and weeks as an example of this. And you can look back over the last 2 or 3 or 4 weeks and ask yourself, what was the role of individuals with a mobile phone in this political transformation? And compare it to Hungary or Czechoslovakia or these other parts of the world sort of decades ago that you mentioned. That is why I think very strongly it's a fundamental paradigm shift. And I believe we are only seeing the beginning of it. And that's why I recommended to the center earlier today that maybe this should be some of the issues studied in order to guide the leadership not just of this country, but all of us, anywhere in the world, how we cope with this fundamental transformation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, please.
There's also one in the faraway back. I think they should also get a chance later on. Yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Mr. President, for your deep and comprehensive lecture about your country, about the economy. And as you are expert, I'd like to ask you 2 questions. One of them about the economy, the second it will be about the politics. The first one, as you know, and also as we know, the world face many economic difficulties and also crises, starting from 1930 till 2008. Do you think that, Mr. President, the world recover, cure from this crisis, or it need more times, years to recover? This is my first question. And my second question...
Could you explain that a little bit so I get the core of the question?
Yes. Do you think that the world recover from the crisis, I mean from the 2008 economic crisis, or it need years to recover from this crisis? And the second question regarding what happened in Ukraine. As you are also expert in politics, what happened in Ukraine in these few days, it put the world really in very, very difficult moment. What do you think in the future? What it will happen, do you think? If there is, do you think that it will something happen which is it will create problem for the world, or it will be settled down? And thank you.
One thing I learned profoundly in the last 5 years, when my country was facing the challenges created by the collapse of the financial system. And almost every leader in Europe and elsewhere, most experts, were always offering us all kinds of advice of what we should do and what we should not do. And I've listened to so many people give ill-informed advice to my own country that I hesitate very strongly to give advice to countries that are in very deep, serious crisis and difficulties. Because this experience for us, illustrates that the problems and the challenges are often much more complicated than those who are watching this from afar can ever imagine. Ukraine is a country without any history of democratic institutions. Both forces, so to speak, the opposition and the government previously have had the chance of governing the country in the last 8, 9, 10 years. And both of them have somehow brought failure, as we have witnessed. In addition, there are complicated religious, cultural, deep-rooted sense of what the country should be. And sometimes in Europe, we speak as if Europe has always been a harmonious, stable, democratic territory. I often remind people that during the first few years of my life, there were only 6 democracies in Europe. Iceland, Ireland, Britain, Sweden, maybe Switzerland, although women couldn't vote. And the rest of Europe was dominated and ruled by either communist, fascist, or Nazi dictatorships. And although we now know the outcome, in the first few years of my life, that outcome was not known. And when I first started as an elected parliamentarian to go to European parliamentary assemblies, I started working with members of parliament from Spain, from Portugal, from Greece, who had either spent most of their adult life in prison during the military dictatorship of those countries, or been in exile. So even in Western Europe, recent history, I call it recent history, gives us a lot of examples that these transformations are difficult. They are not easy. So we should be humble in our advice and in our judgment. The difference is, however, as I said before, that now instantly events are reported. We could yesterday watch John Kerry make his speech in Kiev as he made it. Anybody anywhere in the global community could form an opinion of that speech. That has never been possible before in a crisis of this kind. And instantly you can indicate your support, approval, or disapproval, or severe opposition. That has never been possible before. That is why those who are in the driving seat of this crisis, both within Ukraine and outside, are in a completely new territory and have, in my opinion, to move very carefully, being aware not only of the deep-rooted difficulties within the country, but also there is now a global constituency that follows this in a way that has never happened before. And you have seen that also in the Arab world. So we will see. Your first question, I will be very brief in the answer to that. I think one of the reasons which I mentioned briefly in my speech, could have explained at greater length, for our recovery, is that somehow we were lucky enough or wise enough to realize early on in the first few months that this was not just a normal economic and financial crisis. This was also a profound political, democratic, social, judicial crisis. And it could never be dealt with simply by the traditional narrow policies of economics. Whereas most of the rest of Europe spent years in trying to deal with the crisis in Greece and Spain and Portugal, etc., and within the Eurozone, on the assumption that this was just yet another financial economic crisis, not also a profound democratic and social crisis. In Spain, almost 50% of those who go to university and finish their degree have no chance of getting a job after they leave university. I ask myself, how do you get a country moving again if half of the young people who go to university do not have any hope in the coming years of being able to work? I can't answer that question. But it's a measure of the social and political crisis that this deep economic and financial shock has created. And that is repeated also in many other different parts of Europe. You had the attempt to replace the elected leaders of Italy, some other Southern European countries, with so-called technocrats. Because the assumption was that somehow if you were technocratically trained in economics, you could get the economy moving again. You could deal with the crisis. They also failed. They are now out of office. And the countries are still struggling with these fundamental crises. So I think also this crisis is different from the previous one in the sense that it has brought home to us that this challenge is deep-rooted, multidimensional challenge in almost all of the fundamental elements of our societies.
Thank you, Mr. President. We will take a question from the back. Yes, yes, please.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for being with us today and for the excellent insights that you gave to us today. My question is having two parts. One of the parts is related to Iceland itself and the mechanism.
But if you don't mind, can you introduce yourself first?
Yes, my name is Yazan. I am the General Manager of Greenwatts Renewable Energy. We are establishing a wind farm in Jordan. So when it comes about talking about clean energy, we relate to this big time. I think Jordan has some kind of similarities with Iceland at certain points of time of being a developing country, and at the same time, Jordan is suffering from financial problems continuously. We have a high population of youth who need jobs. They are highly educated. We have good human capital. However, jobs are not available. One of the biggest problems that we are facing in Jordan today is the issue of energy and the very expensive energy which is coming from and it's imported from outside of Jordan. So renewable energy is going to be a cheapener to the lives of the Jordanians. Now, my question to you is in two sides. The first side is the mechanism that Iceland managed to reform itself and become the phoenix of Europe without going through the chaos cycle. And the second part is what's the moral responsibility that Iceland has as a role model towards the third world developing countries into transferring the know-how to these countries and making them succeed. Thank you.
Excuse me, can you explain the first question a little bit more?
My question, the first question is the mechanism that when Iceland was suffering from the financial crisis and the deep trouble that they were in, how did they manage to get out of that without going through the chaos cycle that we are seeing today in certain countries where people, they want to reform, but the reform is going through some kind of chaos and disturbance that is not, giving them the best results needed for such situation.
Well, if I get your question correctly, you're asking how we got through the crisis without the people rising up or creating this social political unrest?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, but if you listen to the first part of my talk and you remember the pictures I put on the screen, it was not so.
Yes,
we had riots and demonstrations. We had an uprising of the sort we've never before seen in our history. We had the police having to defend the parliament day and night. We had the police having to defend the central bank and preventing the crowd from taking the central bank over. It probably would have been the first time in history where the crowd takes over the central bank. And you had the same thing in the Prime Minister's office, in the ministries, and so on. And as I said in my speech, as we moved into January, 4 months after the banks collapsed, what I feared most when I woke up every morning was not whether we would recover economically. I knew we would do that sooner or later. I didn't know how many years or decades it would take. But whether the same evening our democratic social structure would still be intact. And this then led to the government resigning. It led to new parliamentary elections. It led to the formation of a new government. It led to the change in the leadership of the central bank and the financial regulatory authority, and so on. And as I have said a number of times, for a peaceful country like Iceland having to experience riots and demonstrations every night in the evenings and fires burning in the center of the city created by the crowds was a completely unknown experience to us. And I think the reason why we were able to calm it and move into a new area was that we realized this was a political and social challenge. We realized we had to deal with the democratic aspirations of the people. We had to adjust to this political will that appeared in this way. So, on our scale, admittedly we are a small country, it was a social upheaval of unparalleled historical proportions. And that is why I feel confident in drawing the analogies between what we experienced and what some of the other European countries experienced, and maybe some of them are still experiencing.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, the energy resources of Jordan, when His Majesty visited Iceland 10 years ago or so, I organized a special seminar for him on the geothermal potential of Jordan, because like Iceland, there are resources, geological resources in Jordan, which will enable you to utilize geothermal power in a way, perhaps not to such a large extent like Iceland, but extensively. And if you combine that with solar energy and other resources, you will be able to deal with your energy crisis in Jordan in a way that is much more successful. But then you have to make the shift, which is this: too much of policy making and thinking on energy in every country, including my own, has been dominated by the formula that these must be big projects. These must be on an extensive scale. It must be based on a central governmental initiative or plan. I'm often asked the question, when did Iceland formulate this grand governmental plan to become a clean energy country? The truth of the matter, there was never such a plan. It is an end result of multitudes of initiatives taken at local levels by villages, communities, small cities over years and few decades. And when it is combined, it ends up as a national transformation. Too many countries, and in too many countries, the excuse is still being made that you have to wait for the national plan to be developed and executed before you start. That is no longer an acceptable excuse, because the beauty of clean energy technologies, whether it's geothermal or solar or wind, is that you can adjust it to one household, one village, small town, as well as big cities. you can transform it from the bottom up, as we have done in our geothermal transformation. So in the case of Jordan and many other countries, it's a question of starting. Some years ago, I had a discussion with some of my friends from Abu Dhabi that they should drill in the desert close to Abu Dhabi, close to the airport perhaps, to see if you also had geothermal resources in Abu Dhabi. It might be a bit unfair because God Almighty has given you a lot of other energy resources. It took me a few years to convince them to do it. But in the end, it was done within the master territory. And what happened? The drilling done by the Icelandic company showed that in addition to everything else, you also have geothermal resources in Abu Dhabi, which might be sufficient to allow you to have the cooling system in your houses driven by localized geothermal resources. I have been told, I don't know whether it's true, that 40% of the energy used in Abu Dhabi is for the air conditioning. Maybe it's not so much. I mean, you will know that better. Even if it's just 20%. If you can replace that with localized geothermal system of air conditioning, it's an enormous contribution. Similarly, Saudi Arabia is now starting to look at the geothermal potential of Saudi Arabia. The Reykjavik Geothermal Company, which did the drilling here in Abu Dhabi within the master territory, has now been in discussion with companies in Saudi Arabia. Because if Saudi Arabia does not discover clean energy resources within Saudi Arabia in the coming decades, they will have to become a net energy importer by the middle of this century. Saudi Arabia. So there are examples all over the Middle East that this transformation can be executed, and Jordan is definitely one of the territories, but it doesn't require a national plan. There's already a sufficient technological expertise and willingness for others, and also training programs available in order for this transformation to start in different parts of the country, sort of here and now. And that is what I would recommend, still recommend today, as I did to His Majesty about 10 years ago.
Thank you, sir. Now I will give a chance for the ladies.
There's also one there at the back. I think we have a little bit of balance between the back and the front.
Yes, between the front and the back. But we must make, sir, balance between male and female.
Okay, then we take the one at the back. Yes, sure, you're right. Yes, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Grímsson. Good evening. I would like to ask you about, throughout your presidency, you have stressed the importance of building bridges with emerging countries. And I would like to know what specific bridges will you build or synergies will you build with the UAE? And my second question is I would like to know which of Iceland's sectors and industry represent the greatest opportunity for UAE based in Iceland? Thank you so much.
Well, what to me is fascinating about this journey of cooperation between Iceland and Abu Dhabi or the UAE is how we can come together in these profitable clean energy transformations in different parts of the world. And that is why I have supported the World Future Energy Summit from the very beginning. That is why I recommended the drilling here in desert. And I can say, if you don't quote me on it, that some of my Abu Dhabi friends thought it was a joke for about a year or two. Because for them it was such a strange perception that there could be geothermal resources in Abu Dhabi. In fact, everywhere where you have oil potential, you can also assume that there is a geothermal potential. And we have been discussing how we could jointly take this experience also to other countries together. And that is an important aspect of our cooperation. In addition, what I mentioned in my speech, the drying of food products, using the Icelandic experience and the IRENA leadership, the fact that the Emirates took the leadership in hosting IRENA here, can, I believe, become one of the most important contributions in the coming years to global food security. We all know that there is a big amount of the food produced in the world which gets destroyed because it can't be stored for a long time. I have been told that up to 20% of the food produced in India get destroyed within a week because of the heat. In the Western world, and partly here also, we solve this problem by having freezing equipment in supermarkets. So people can go and buy frozen food products in supermarkets. You cannot implement that all over Africa or Asia or the rest of the world. It's an impossibility. So I ask you, as I asked many others, can you give me an example of enhancing the endurance and the storage of the food we already produce in the world in a more effective way than the old-fashioned model of drying food, which is mankind's oldest way of preserving food? And nobody has been able to come up with that method. So whereas it takes months to dry food in other conditions, we have developed a rather simple technology to do it in 5 days. And then it can be stored with zero infrastructure, and I emphasize that again, zero infrastructure for up to 2 years. And now we have a project where IRENA, Abu Dhabi, Iceland, the FAO and others are taking this model forward and doing experiments in different parts of the world, demonstrating to the global community a project which is closely followed by the World Bank, of how we could perhaps make the single most important contribution to enhanced food security in the world by modernizing, based on solar, wind, geothermal, this old method of drying food. I think another area where perhaps we have to be more pioneering, and it is a little bit more difficult to predict where it will take us, is this trade in energy between countries. Emirates and Abu Dhabi and Masdar are investing in solar energy in Spain, in wind energy in England. Your part of the world already becoming an important player in the European energy markets. But it's absolutely clear that Britain, Germany, France, Netherlands, and the others will not be able to solve their energy crisis in the coming years without ocean cables, electric cables on the seabed, linking especially countries like Norway and Iceland that produce hydropower into the European grid. Because every energy resource in Britain, for example, is of such a nature that you cannot increase the supply suddenly if the heat goes up or the demand increases suddenly, because all the energy forms are based on more or less sort of constant production. Hydropower is the only way through the building up of dams that you can increase the production within a day or two suddenly to meet excessive demands. That is why Norway built a cable to the Netherlands to help the Dutch energy market to deal with sudden fluctuations in demand. And if Britain doesn't get the same solution within 10 or 15 years, they risk the entire energy system going bust in peak demand periods. So if Europe is going to be linked through ocean cables of this kind, it will be an opportunity for global investment in energy trade of a scale that we have never seen before. And giving the logic which is behind building up Abu Dhabi as a center for for energy debate, as the World Energy Summit illustrates, and many other activities, it would only be natural for leading companies as well as investors and others from this part of the world to take an interest in the future of the European energy market of this scale.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, we will go to the back, as President said. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, sure. My name is Dmitry from the Embassy of Ukraine. Yeah, so this is quite a high time. Your Excellency, Mr. President, honorable audience, this is more of a kind of a command than the question. This meeting is devoted to a different topic, I'm sure, but I cannot sit still as long as this topic is brought up. So basically, I think it would be more appropriate just to invite anybody who's interested in getting some comments and some facts about the current situation in Ukraine to approach me after the lecture. And because I appreciate very much, Your Excellency, your remarks on the current situation, but I would also like to say that there are some points, I guess, that needs kind of a clarification and some of accentuation, I would put it that way. So I would not take any more time of you. I'm just saying that I would be available to answer any questions you would address me regarding that topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I encourage everybody to make use of this opportunity. Thank you very much for your willingness to answer questions on this afterwards.
Yes, the middle. Can you stand up, please? That we can see you. You, yes.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's very interesting and informative, really. In view of your remarkable efforts, paradigm shift in reducing the imports of fossil fuel for transportation system, my question is like this: do you subscribe to the idea of imposing tax on carbon emissions because many countries now actually import fossil fuel, and the important thing is that you need to look into the climate change, as you mentioned. Very important that we should look for the future, and we don't have refugees out of the climate change. So my question is like this: do you subscribe that people should be relieved, really, and by this tax, imposing tax on industries and corporations which produce emissions, CO2 emissions, which is really going on a higher scale in many countries? Are your plan is still going very well in trying to reduce the transportation, consumption of oil and gas from the Middle East, or you are still a bit short of that? Thank you very much.
Well, since my answers to most questions have been rather long, I will simply answer this question by saying yes. I think that is a way that we need to go forward.
President Grímsson, my name is Alexander Cornwell and I'm a journalist with Gulf Hit News here in the UAE. My first question, you spoke about working with the Mazda Institute regarding the drying food with solar. Could you please clarify exactly what these discussions are and what level they are? Are you looking for a term of investment into Iceland, or are you looking to work here in the UAE? My second question is about foreign policy. As you may know, the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain withdrew their ambassadors from Qatar today. Does Iceland think that the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization? Thank you.
Well, on the first question, this cooperation on drying of food is primarily based on taking this knowledge and technology and the way of dealing with food to different parts of the world. It's not a question of investing in Abu Dhabi or doing it in Iceland. It's a cooperation aimed at convincing people all over the world that not only can the drying of food using either solar, wind, or geothermal, and even localized form of energy help us to make use of the food which we now throw away. For example, in most countries, half of the volume of fish which is caught from the ocean is thrown back into the ocean, either as heads or bones or the inside of the fish. We only utilize about half of the volume that we take out of the ocean. Similarly, you can take a region in Pakistan which produces apricots. Every year, almost a third of the harvest gets destroyed before you get it to market. So this is more intended as a way of informing the world that this can be done by the people themselves in different parts, different food productions. But it needs a cooperation to bring this forward, a kind of a visionary cooperation, although it's also good business. And giving the aspiration of IRENA and the Emirates in hosting IRENA and our experience in Iceland, and the vision of FAO to increasing food security in the world, we have created what I call this informal cooperation, having what we call pilot projects in different parts of the world on a small scale, because we realize we have to convince people. The problem is this is too simple as a solution. We have been culturally and politically accustomed to complicated solutions. We somehow assume that the solution to a big problem cannot be simple. Has not been available for a long time. But in this case, this is so. It only needs to be brought home to people by concrete example. And that is what this cooperation is all about. I have said a number of times regarding your second question here today that one of the things the last 5 years taught me is not to offer judgment or advices on the situations in other countries. I was not aware until you put this question of these events that you mentioned. So it would be completely contradictory to my own principles to start commenting on it within a minute or so after I hear it for the first time. But it clearly is an important change, and all of us will have to reflect on it. But if I'm going to follow my own advice, I will not be able to respond to that question sort of here or now. Maybe if you invite me back, we will see. No, I know that. I know that.
Thank you, sir. If you excuse me, sir, we will take a last question. This will be you, please.
Thank you for a very interesting speech. Andrew Polondine, WH International Architects. My question is very simple. I'm wondering if we had an alternative history and the US Federal Reserve had taken the Icelandic route and allowed the banks to fail, would we be in a better situation with the world economy now, or would it be a further abyss?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And unfortunately, nobody has had the audacity to make that experiment. So the answer, of course, has to be a speculation. But in this context, based partly on our experience in Iceland, I have often asked a European and an American audience, why are we assuming that banks are somehow different from other companies, airlines, railways, shopping malls? Why are we assuming the banks are somehow the holy churches of the modern economy, so they cannot fail, not go bankrupt? Why is it that we think in our economic strategies and our politics that banks are somehow the untouchables in terms of letting them go their own way if they fail in the capitalist system? On the contrary, I think the basis of good banking is to allow banks occasionally to go bankrupt, because it serves as a warning to the others. If we send the message that somehow banking has become a foolproof exercise, that nobody can fail because the taxpayer will always bail them out, it is inherently a formula for bad banking. Let me also point out to you, you might find it interesting in this context, that one of the things we discovered in Iceland after the banks collapsed, that the Icelandic banks, like American banks or European banks or banks here also in this part of the world, have in fact in the last 10 years become high-tech companies, hiring engineers, computer specialists, mathematicians, in fact, draining the growth potential of IT companies, because they take the same skilled personnel, high-level mathematicians, engineers, and others, into the banking system, paying them higher salaries and big bonuses. So innovative industrial and high-tech and IT companies will not be able to realize their growth potential because the banks have taken a big part of the qualified manpower. So when the banks failed in Iceland, there was suddenly this pool of engineering talent, mathematical talent, computer talent available on the market. And within 6 months, they had all been hired by our IT and high-tech sector. And companies of that kind, which in the previous years had been unable to realize their growth potentials, suddenly were able to move forward in a highly productive and profitable way. So in fact, in the last 4 years, they have seen a much more successful growth period than before. And this, I've told my American and European friends, demonstrates that if you want your economy to succeed in the competitive high-tech IT elements of the 21st century global economy, a big banking sector, even a very successful banking sector, is fundamentally bad news for your country, because it drains these other competitive sectors that are more critical for a competitive position, because the global financial system is such you can get money from anywhere. But if you no longer have the innovative talent of people from science, computers, engineering, and so on, you are in trouble. But the problem is that in economic policy making and in thinking about the financial system, we have not yet transformed our policies and thinking on the basis that the banks are now high-tech companies, not financial companies. They're high-tech companies. They are competing with the engineering firms and the industrial sector, not with other banks, but with these sectors in your own country. And also, in a response to your question, I put up a picture here before which had Facebook and many of these international IT social media trademarks. What would have a bigger consequence on the global economy, on our world, if Facebook, Google, or Twitter went bankrupt tomorrow than 3 banks in London or in New York? Is the social media now more important for our economies and our societies than the financial sector? I leave you with that question, because nobody in any governmental position would think of saving Facebook with taxpayers' money, while at the same time it's a legitimate question to save banks with taxpayers' money. So I think partly, as an answer to your question, I think we have an outdated model of which companies can go bankrupt and which companies cannot. And I personally don't believe that the banks are somehow the holy churches of the 21st century economy, that they cannot be allowed to fail. If we had not allowed them to fail in Iceland, I wouldn't be here. I would still be back in Iceland, struggling with the day-to-day challenges of my people.
And this answer wraps up our event for tonight. I once again thanks the President Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, the President of the Republic of Iceland, for a great presentation, and a special thanks to this amazing and engaging audience for enriching tonight's discussion. On behalf of Dr. Jamal Sanad al-Suwaidi and my colleagues at the ECSSR, I thank you for attending these lectures, and I kindly invite you, everyone, to the reception outside. I look forward to seeing you, all of you, in our next event entitled The Challenges of Globalization and the Need for Solidarity, presented by the former President of Republic of Poland, President Lech Walesa. This will be on Sunday, March 9th, 2014 at 7:30 p.m. Thank you a lot and good night, and see you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.